Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. Settle yourself into comfort, and allow the weight of the present day to ease away. Imagine, for a moment, that we are opening the cover of a heavy leather-bound book, its pages softened by age and faintly scented with time. This is not an ordinary volume, it is a ledger, a careful recording of lives that once filled the hushed rooms and gaslit streets of Victorian England. Yet these entries are not of business, nor of ledgers meant for trade. Instead, this one preserves whispers, half-forgotten stories, and faint stains of scandal once tucked discreetly into folds of linen and silk. The Victorian world was an age of contrast. Outwardly, it was defined by polished manners, lace-trimmed respectability, and the comforting rhythm of etiquette. But beneath these layers, like hidden embroidery on the inside of a garment, lived the small dramas, mistakes, and quiet indiscretions that no one wished to acknowledge. These were not the sensational tales that splashed across headlines, but the softer, more intimate murmurs, those that flickered briefly in parlors, were recorded quietly in letters, and sometimes disappeared altogether into silence. Over the course of these 10 explorations, we will turn the fragile pages of this linen ledger together. We will not rush, nor will we pry with force. Instead, we will allow each account to emerge slowly, like the unfolding of a pressed flower. Delicate and calming. You may find the details intriguing, and at times perhaps a little curious, but always softened by the distance of history, and by the gentle awareness that these lives, though once tangled with secrets, have long since found their quiet conclusion. Now, let us begin with the first entry, the soft murmur of scandal whispered not in the streets, but behind the heavy curtains of the Victorian parlor. Imagine stepping into a Victorian parlor. The fire glows steadily, the gaslights hum faintly, and the wallpaper, patterned with florals, presses close around you. In this space, appearances are everything. A lady's gloved hand rests lightly upon the arm of a chair, a gentleman stirs his tea with quiet precision, and conversation floats just above the surface of propriety. Yet beneath these calm gestures lies another layer. It is here, in such restrained settings, that whispers of scandal were exchanged, subdued, careful, never spoken too loudly, yet never entirely absent. Victorian society was acutely aware of appearances. Reputation was not merely a matter of personal pride, it was social currency. Determining one's ability to marry well, to secure business, or even to be welcomed in polite company. Gossip, therefore, was never frivolous. It was a quiet force, shaping lives with the brush of suggestion. The whisper of an indiscretion, even if unproven, could ripple outward, unsettling families and entire households. Many scandals never reached the printed page of a newspaper. Instead, they lived and traveled within parlors like these, borne along in carefully lowered voices. A hostess might drop a subtle comment over the clink of china cups, and a guest would nod with polite restraint, carrying the news discreetly to another gathering. In this way, the parlor became not only a place of hospitality but also a stage for managing and reshaping reputations. The topics of these whispers were varied. Sometimes it was the sudden absence of a familiar guest, a gentleman who had quietly left town under ambiguous circumstances. At other times, it might concern the hurried marriage of a young woman, arranged just a little too swiftly, with timing that suggested an urgency not spoken aloud. The parlor served as a filter. Scandals were rarely shouted, but they were never left entirely unspoken. What makes these parlor whispers particularly intriguing is how they blended intimacy with restraint. Guests might lower their voices, leaning closer as though shielding their words from the wallpaper itself. Yet, there was also a curious calmness in the way these exchanges were handled. No one raised their voice, no one gestured wildly. The scandal was wrapped in politeness, cloaked in the very manners that defined Victorian life. In this way, gossip became an unspoken game. One might offer just enough information to suggest knowledge, while holding back the rest, ensuring curiosity remained unsatisfied. Listeners, in turn, were invited to piece together the rest with their imagination. It was a way of passing time, of sharing small intimacies without stepping fully into the impropriety of direct accusation. It is important to remember that many of these whispered scandals were gentle in their nature. They might concern a misplaced letter, a too long glance at a ball, or a sudden change in someone's routine. While some stories touched on more serious matters, inheritance disputes, quiet affairs, or improprieties, they were often softened by the hush in which they were told. Time has further softened them, leaving behind a faint impression rather than a sharp outline. The parlor was also a place where women, often restricted from more direct roles in society, wielded subtle influence. Through the act of conversation, they became keepers and distributors of information, shaping how scandals were remembered or forgotten. In some ways, the management of gossip was a form of quiet power, wrapped delicately in silk and lace. These whispered scandals rarely erupted into open conflict. Instead, they lingered like faint perfume, present, noticeable, but never overpowering. For the families involved, they could be burdensome, yet for society at large, they became part of the fabric of daily life. The rhythm of gossip was as regular as afternoon tea, and just as carefully orchestrated. When we pause to imagine these scenes, we might also reflect on the nature of secrecy itself. Often, what was left unsaid carried more weight than what was spoken. The silence between words, the glance across a table, the empty chair at a gathering, these small details spoke volumes to those attuned to notice. In this gentle light, scandal loses its harsh edges. It becomes less about the act itself, and more about the way it was perceived, shared, and remembered. A misplaced gesture, a vanished guest, a whisper half-spoken, each became threads woven into the larger fabric of Victorian life, subtle yet enduring. As we step back from the parlor, let us carry with us the understanding that scandal, in this age, was not always loud. More often, it was quiet, refined, softened by manners, and hidden behind layers of silk. It lived not in open confrontation, but in the measured tones of conversation, the folding of a fan, or the pause before a name was spoken. In closing this first entry of the ledger, we might compare those whispers to the faint rustle of fabric in a still room. They were present, but never forceful, suggestive, but never shouted. In their restraint, they reflected the very essence of Victorian society, where appearances were everything, and truth often lived quietly beneath the surface. Now, with this glimpse of scandal contained within parlors and whispers, we gently turn the page. Ahead, the ledger reveals deeper curiosities, tales of those who vanished from sight, and the questions their absences left behind, and so, softly, we step forward into the next entry. The Victorian era had a peculiar fascination with disappearances. At a time when record-keeping was formal, travel was often limited, and social standing was paramount, the sudden vanishing of an individual, particularly a young woman of wealth or promise, echoed far beyond her family. These disappearances were rarely spoken of directly in public, yet they left behind a trail of questions, carefully couched in the quiet language of speculation. To vanish in Victorian England did not always mean to disappear completely from the earth. Sometimes, it meant stepping outside the narrow bounds of expectation, eloping quietly to another town, seeking independence beyond a controlling family. Or even beginning life anew under a different name. Yet, the world of the Victorian heiress was tightly bound, her movements often observed and recorded. A sudden absence, therefore, was always felt keenly. In newspapers, these cases were often softened, framed as a young woman simply visiting relatives or recovering her health in the countryside. The truth, however, was usually more complex. Some young women disappeared into the quiet shelter of a convent, while others found themselves entangled in situations their families preferred never to acknowledge. The ledger records them not with sensational headlines, but with faint entries, hints at lives that stepped outside the expected path. The fear of scandal hung heavily over such vanishings. For families of social prominence, it was not merely the loss of a daughter or sister that troubled them, but the potential unraveling of reputation. An unaccounted-for absence might suggest impropriety, a forbidden romance, or a refusal to marry as expected. Thus, whispers in parlors carried the burden of interpretation, each guest filling the silence with their own imagined explanation. Heiresses in particular lived within the gaze of others. Their inheritances were as much a social tool as a financial one, shaping marriages, alliances, and futures. To vanish was, in some ways, to disrupt a carefully laid network of expectations. Families often worked quietly to retrieve their missing daughters, not always out of love alone, but also from a desire to restore what society would see as order. Some vanishings were innocent enough, perhaps a retreat to a distant cousin's estate, perhaps even an elopement that blossomed into a legitimate marriage. Others, however, ended less gently. There were cases where disappearances concealed deeper troubles, financial disputes, unwanted pregnancies, or hidden illnesses. The reality often remained known only to a small circle, leaving outsiders to fill the silence with rumor. It is worth pausing to consider how such vanishings felt in their time. Without the ability to communicate instantly, each unanswered letter stretched into days, then weeks. Families waited by the window for a carriage that never came, or strained to hear the postman's knock. The absence of a single person changed the rhythm of an entire household. The silence of her absence filled rooms more heavily than any sound. Not every disappearance carried with it a tragic conclusion. Some heiresses, in stepping away from the expected path, sought lives of quiet independence. Records suggest a few resided under assumed names in coastal towns, their fortunes quietly sustaining them as they lived unremarkable yet free lives. These women were rarely spoken of again in their families, as if their names had been folded shut like an unused fan. Yet there were also vanishings that lingered in darker memory. The canals of industrial cities, the cliffs near the sea, and the shadowed alleys of London occasionally swallowed young women whose stories were never fully explained. These rare but unsettling tales left deep imprints on communities, though they were often softened in the telling, their sharper edges dulled by euphemism and silence. For those who remained, parents, siblings, friends, the absence of resolution often proved heavier than grief itself. In the ledger, one finds not only the names of the vanished but also the shadows of those who searched. Notes of letters written, journeys made, and quiet inquiries placed in neighboring towns appear with quiet regularity. These faint records serve as reminders of the quiet persistence of love, even in the face of uncertainty. It is perhaps this uncertainty that explains why stories of vanished heiresses held such a strong place in the Victorian imagination. They reminded society of the fragility of order, of the possibility that even within well-furnished parlors and carefully arranged households, unpredictability could enter quietly and remain unanswered. The newspapers moved on quickly, the parlors filled with new whispers, and yet within private families, the absence lingered. Sometimes years later, a relative might recall her name only in hushed tones, softened by time, her story half remembered but never fully forgotten. In this way, the vanishings of heiresses became both a personal sorrow and a quiet cultural motif, a reminder that not every life followed the expected pattern. When we consider these stories now, softened by more than a century of distance, they lose their edge of immediacy. Instead, they invite reflection on the nature of absence, on the quiet courage of those who stepped away, and on the restraint with which their families chose to remember them. They become less scandal than shadow, less drama than quiet curiosity, lingering gently in the margins of history. In the end, the vanished heiresses remind us that scandal was not always about loud betrayal or public disgrace. Sometimes, it was about the silence left behind, the chair at the dinner table that remained empty, the letter that never arrived, the life that slipped just out of sight. And as we gently close this entry in the ledger, we notice the quiet shift of the narrative, moving from absence to presence. For the next page reveals not the vanished, but those who remain present, dressed in their elegant garments, bound tightly by fashion, carrying their own contradictions beneath corsets and lace. When we imagine Victorian society, clothing often comes first to mind. The silhouette of the age is unmistakable, tightly laced corsets narrowing the waist, sweeping skirts rustling with layers of crinoline, and high collars pressed neatly into place. These garments were not only expressions of style, they were also symbols of propriety, duty, and restraint. Yet, as with so much in Victorian life, beneath the polished surface lay contradictions, and beneath the fabric lived hidden stories. The corset in particular came to embody these tensions. On one hand, it was celebrated as a mark of elegance and discipline, shaping the body into the admired form of the day. On the other, it concealed discomfort, restricted breath, and often carried quiet health consequences. Women wore them not only to meet social standards but also to signal their respectability. To appear without one in polite society would have been unthinkable, almost scandalous in itself. These garments served as both armor and prison. They allowed women to enter the ballroom or parlor with confidence, yet simultaneously hid the natural ease of movement. Beneath the rustle of silk and the shimmer of satin, there often lived discomfort, an ache in the ribs, a breath held just a little too long. The contradiction was ever present, beauty was achieved, but at the cost of freedom. Beyond physical discomfort, attire became a language. Subtle differences in fabrics, ribbons, or the tilt of a bonnet conveyed signals that were quietly understood among the observant. A ribbon slightly out of season, or a dress a shade too daring, could spark whispers not unlike those exchanged in parlors. Clothing was more than fashion, it was a ledger written in fabric, carrying coded entries about class, respectability, and sometimes, quiet rebellion. It is here, in these small choices of attire, that contradiction becomes most clear. The corset symbolized obedience, yet women often used it to manipulate their image, shaping themselves in ways that commanded attention. A daring cut of sleeve or the shimmer of foreign fabric might hint at travels, wealth, or desires unspoken. Fashion became both a shield and a whisper, masking indiscretion while simultaneously suggesting it. Even the process of dressing carried its own layer of secrecy. Servants, often present in these intimate moments, became silent witnesses to the contradictions of attire. They saw the loosened corset at day's end, the hurried stitching to mend a torn hem before a gathering, or the small sigh of relief as a tightly bound ribbon was finally loosened. These private glimpses revealed the cost of appearances. Even as society insisted upon their maintenance, the contradictions extended beyond clothing itself into what attire concealed. Hidden letters slipped into bodices, tokens tucked within gloves, and quiet exchanges of glances across a ballroom were all shielded by fabric. Clothing not only structured the body but also provided space for secrecy, another layer in the ledger of hidden lives. There is a calmness in imagining these details now. The urgency of the moment has softened with time, leaving only the image of garments carefully tended, preserved in trunks or displayed in museums. The contradictions they carried, the tension between restraint and expression, now seem more like quiet echoes, reminders of lives lived within layers of fabric and expectation. The presence of attire also influenced men, though in subtler ways. A gentleman's suit, always well-tailored, became a uniform of composure. A waistcoat of fine cut or a cravat tied with precision spoke of discipline and control. Yet these, too, concealed hidden realities: financial strain, borrowed garments, or quiet departures from convention masked beneath polished seams. The unspoken rule of Victorian attire was that one must never appear to try too hard, yet also never fail to meet the standard. It was a delicate balance, and one that could quietly reveal or obscure scandal. An heiress dressed too modestly might invite speculation of reduced fortune. A widow in colors too bright, too soon after loss, might awaken whispers of impropriety. In this way, clothing became both evidence and disguise. The paradox of clothing extended even into health. Doctors of the age sometimes warned of the dangers of tight lacing, while others prescribed specific corsets for support. The same garment was accused of harm and praised for virtue, embodying the contradictions of the age itself. For the women who wore them, however, the experience was personal. Each tug of ribbon and press of whalebone felt individually, yet shared collectively. As we reflect upon these details, we begin to see attire not as static objects but as living elements of scandal and secrecy. Each gown, each corset, each ribbon became part of a larger performance, one where the audience saw elegance, but the wearer carried contradictions. The garments themselves, now silent, still seem to whisper faintly of these hidden lives. It is soothing to realize that these garments, once filled with tension and expectation, now rest in stillness. Their contradictions have resolved with time, their whispers folded into the calm of history. The fabric no longer restrains, no longer conceals, it simply rests, reminding us of the quiet interplay between appearance and truth. As we close this entry in the ledger, we may imagine setting aside a carefully folded gown, placing it gently back into its trunk. The whispers of corsets and contradictions fade, replaced by the stillness of the study or the hush of the parlor. Ahead, the ledger opens to a new page, one where garments are replaced by sermons, and where the contradictions lie not in fabric, but in faith. The next entry waits patiently, offering glimpses into the quiet failings of those entrusted with moral authority, the clergymen whose lives revealed both devotion and scandal, faith and fallibility. The Victorian clergyman occupied a unique place within society. He was expected to embody virtue, to guide his parishioners with wisdom, and to serve as a visible reminder of morality in a world of shifting fortunes. His collar and pulpit were not merely symbols of office, they were symbols of trust. Yet even here, within the sanctity of the church, contradictions emerged. Behind sermons carefully spoken and prayers faithfully offered, there sometimes lived private weaknesses, moments of human frailty that quietly unsettled the communities they served. Congregations often held their clergymen in quiet reverence, not simply for their learning, but for the steadiness they were believed to represent. To falter publicly would have been unthinkable, yet scandals did occur. They were rarely shouted in headlines, instead, they were recorded softly, through rumor, private letters, and quiet removals to distant parishes. The ledger preserves these moments with restraint, recognizing them not as loud downfalls but as subtle fractures in the carefully tended surface of faith. Some of these scandals involved impropriety, an attachment to a parishioner too close to propriety, a letter exchange that was later discovered, or suspicions that never quite found confirmation. Others were less personal, involving disputes over money, church property, or the use of tithes. Each incident reminded parishioners that even men of faith lived within human limits. The shock was never in the action alone, but in the contradiction it revealed, holiness faltering into humanity. The parish itself often played a role in how these matters were remembered. For some, forgiveness was offered quietly, the community choosing to protect rather than expose their shepherd. In other instances, whispers traveled through pews like the rustle of hymnals, spreading beyond the church walls into parlors and drawing rooms. Even then, the tone remained restrained. One did not accuse loudly, one only noted, softly, that something seemed amiss. Not all scandals were romantic or financial. Some concerned matters of doctrine itself. A clergyman who preached too liberally, or one who resisted reforms, might find himself quietly questioned. His faithfulness to Scripture could be debated in whispers. Not in theological treatises but in the subtle tilt of heads over afternoon tea. For a society so invested in appearances, even a shift in tone could spark speculation. For the clergymen themselves, the burden of expectation was heavy. They were not permitted the luxury of visible doubt, nor of visible fatigue. Their weaknesses had to be hidden as carefully as any impropriety in high society. And so, when scandals arose, they were felt deeply, not only for their practical consequences, but for the way they unsettled the image of constancy their office demanded. The ledger does not record names loudly here. Instead, it offers fragments, a transfer to another parish without explanation. A line in a private diary noting disappointment, a small circle of parishioners who ceased their visits. Each entry is softened by time, leaving behind only the faint impression of scandal without the sharpness of accusation. It is soothing to realize that, even in their failings, clergymen were often remembered with a degree of compassion. For all their contradictions, they remained human, and Victorian society, so quick to preserve appearances, was also careful to allow certain matters to fade quietly. Silence became its own form of forgiveness. The scandals of clergymen, then, were less about spectacle than about the quiet recognition that perfection was never possible. They remind us of the subtle interplay between expectation and reality, between the desire for constancy and the inevitability of weakness. These contradictions, gently preserved in the ledger, speak less of disgrace than of humanity wrapped within the garments of faith. At times, these matters were resolved with resignation, a clergyman retiring quietly, or choosing to travel abroad under the pretense of health. Other times, the scandal simply dissolved into silence, parishioners choosing not to recall what had once troubled them. In the quiet of history, these stories lose their sting, becoming part of the larger fabric of Victorian life, where even faith was not untouched by secrecy. The calm reflection these stories inspire today is different from the unease they once carried. To us, they serve as reminders of the universality of imperfection, of the shared humanity that links parishioner and pastor alike. In this way, the scandals of clergymen do not unsettle, but soothe, showing that even in ages of rigid expectation, gentleness could be found in how failings were handled. As we set aside this entry in the ledger, we hear not the harsh tones of judgment, but the softer notes of compassion. The voices of the past remind us that scandal was not always about exposure, it was just as often about discretion, forgiveness, and the quiet acknowledgement of imperfection. The next page turns us gently away from the pulpit and towards something even more intimate, the private letters of individuals, never meant to be read beyond their intended recipient. These folded sheets of paper carried affection, secrecy, and sometimes threats, reminders of how words, even in their most delicate form, could stir scandal when revealed. And so, we move forward, from the sermons of the clergyman to the whispers written in ink. The ledger waits patiently, its next entry glimmering faintly in the lamplight, ready to open upon the secrets of letters never meant to be read. In the Victorian world, the letter was more than mere correspondence. It was an extension of one's voice, carrying tone and sentiment across distance and time. Before the telephone, and long before instant messages, paper carried the weight of affection, confession, and sometimes, betrayal. Every household possessed its stationery, embossed letterheads for the wealthier, plain but neatly folded sheets for the modest. Wax seals marked them, ribbons tied them, and careful handwriting clothed them with personality. A letter could be a vessel of joy, a record of business, or the keeper of words never meant for anyone beyond the recipient's eyes. Yet scandals often bloomed when these words found other readers. The ledger records many such incidents, not with drama, but with a soft melancholy. A misplaced love letter discovered by the wrong hands, a private confession passed on, unthinkingly, from servant to mistress, even the simple misfortune of a letter lost and opened by a stranger. Each tale is like a pressed flower, fragile and fading, carrying traces of the emotion it once held. Imagine the young woman who folded her heart into words, sealing them in wax, believing her sentiments would remain private. Yet, one misdirected post could undo her composure, casting quiet ripples of speculation through her social circle. In an era where even the slightest impropriety could stain reputations, a single letter carried more than ink, it carried risk. The intrigue of letters was not limited to romance. Families wrote with candid honesty when distance granted them privacy, confessing frustrations or doubts not spoken aloud in drawing rooms. But once those words reached unintended readers, grievances that might have faded quietly instead became the subject of whispers, layered with scandal. And then there were political letters, quiet exchanges between reformers, or confidential words between men of influence. Some were stolen, others leaked. Though not shouted in the public press, they left quiet traces in the ledger, reminders that secrecy was always precarious. Even servants played a part in these stories. Trusted with the delivery or safekeeping of correspondence, they sometimes became silent keepers of secrets. A maid might glance at an envelope, or a butler might notice a hurriedly hidden note. Rarely spoken of, but quietly remembered, these observations added another thread to the fabric of suspicion. In the stillness of history, these moments feel softened, even calming. There is no rush to judgment now, no urgency in the discovery. What remains is the image of paper gently unfolding, inked words carrying emotions we recognize even today: love, fear, doubt, and longing. The ledger suggests that letters themselves carried a paradox. They were both private and permanent. Spoken words might vanish in the air, but a letter lingered, preserved long after its writer intended. For this reason, they became some of the most enduring sources of scandal, leaving traces where silence might otherwise have hidden all. In this way, letters became time capsules of Victorian intimacy. They allow us, at a distance, to sense the texture of daily lives, not only the scandals they carried but the ordinary tenderness they recorded. They tell us of longing separated by miles, of apologies too difficult to speak aloud, of fears softened when pressed into words. Occasionally, letters did not need to be intercepted to create unease. Sometimes they were written in a tone too ambiguous, leaving the reader uncertain of the writer's true meaning. A misplaced phrase could be read as affection, suspicion, or mockery, depending on the eye that saw it. These ambiguities left lingering discomfort, ripples that spread through friendships and households. The stillness we feel today while considering these matters is a far cry from the quiet unease they once inspired. To us, they are simply fragments of humanity, moments when the written word carried both comfort and risk, both intimacy and exposure. As we close this section of the ledger, one cannot help but reflect on how permanent ink can be, and how delicate privacy once was in a world so reliant on the written word. Every folded sheet, every drop of wax, was both a shield and a vulnerability. The next entry in the ledger will guide us further inward, not to letters or words, but to the hidden rooms where scandal sometimes lingered unseen. These were spaces behind walls, tucked into architecture itself, where silence and secrecy left their marks. We turn the page softly, leaving letters behind, and step toward the mysteries concealed within the very houses themselves. Victorian homes were more than dwellings. They were layered environments, filled with rooms that reflected not only function but social order. The parlors, the dining rooms, the bedrooms, Each space held its rules and expectations. Yet, behind the main chambers, there were other spaces. Some discreet, some secret. It is in these quieter corners that scandal sometimes found its resting place. To understand the nature of these rooms, one must remember the strict hierarchy of Victorian domestic life. Servants moved invisibly, passing through back corridors and staircases that the household rarely saw. These service passages, designed for discretion, sometimes witnessed more than they were meant to. There were also hidden rooms, built into the architecture for reasons of privacy, storage, or sometimes secrecy. A concealed door might lead to a study where letters were written unobserved. A shuttered alcove might shelter a tryst or a secret conversation. Rarely acknowledged in polite company, these spaces were known in whispers. One account from the ledger describes the unused attic chambers of a modest London home. The rooms were small and unheated, meant originally for servants, but left vacant when the household reduced its staff. It was there that a daughter of the family retreated, not in defiance but in search of solitude. Her visits, however, gave rise to rumors. Neighbors noticed her disappearance for hours at a time. And curiosity soon spun into speculation. Servants, too, knew the closed spaces intimately. While their work kept them within kitchens, sculleries, and back stairwells, they often bore silent witness to household matters kept from the public eye. A door left open by mistake, a voice carried down through floorboards, or a hurried movement glimpsed in passing, these became threads of knowledge not spoken aloud, but quietly remembered. Some homes featured what were called withdrawing rooms, spaces where family members might retire from company, shielded from scrutiny. There, emotions less polished than those shown in the parlor could find expression. Yet when these private scenes were overheard or misinterpreted, they often found their way into quiet murmurs that traveled further than intended. The ledger recalls also the locked room, a concept that held a special fascination in Victorian thought. To lock a room was to suggest the presence of something worth protecting or concealing. Sometimes it was a treasured collection, sometimes a personal diary, and sometimes, though rarely spoken of, it was a person's retreat from duties they could not bear. Yet not all closed doors led to scandal. Many were simply spaces of necessity, storage rooms for linen, or chambers where trunks of clothing rested between seasons. Still, the very act of being hidden lent them an air of quiet possibility. And possibility, in a society built on appearances, was often enough to invite speculation. Visitors, especially those who stayed overnight, noted these rooms differently. A guest might glimpse an unmarked passage, or hear footsteps behind walls. The unfamiliarity of the architecture itself created an atmosphere where secrets seemed to lurk. In some houses, architecture itself spoke of things unsaid. Staircases that twisted away into darkness. Cellars that remained locked, narrow spaces where air seemed to settle differently. These places became the background of lives, quietly absorbing what their walls were never meant to tell. The ledger makes no accusations in recounting these spaces. Instead, it observes them with the same calm tone it applies to all things, as part of the fabric of life. A room might shelter a secret, but it might equally shelter a moment of stillness, a pause between the demands of the day. When we reflect upon them now, these closed rooms seem peaceful, even comforting. They are relics of a time when privacy was rare and much desired, when a single locked door could feel like sanctuary. Perhaps that is why they linger so strongly in memory. For in an age of constant scrutiny, these hidden rooms represented both freedom and danger. They were the boundaries between what was seen and what remained veiled. The ledger closes this entry with a simple reflection, that silence itself can be scandalous, when the world insists on answers. Yet silence, too, can be soothing. Within these closed spaces, we find echoes not of disgrace, but of rest, and now, as we gently turn the page, we leave these closed doors behind. Ahead lies the next entry, where the ledger moves not through houses or rooms, but through the carefully polished rituals of society, rituals that, beneath their polish, often concealed their own quiet contradictions. The Victorian stage was a place of light and shadow, both literally and figuratively. Chandeliers blazed above polished audiences, while behind the velvet curtains, life moved at a different rhythm. The theater was celebrated, admired, even adored. Yet, at the same time, it was whispered about, treated with suspicion by those who equated the stage with moral ambiguity. Performers themselves often lived in two worlds. On stage, they shone, their voices carrying across gaslit halls. Off stage, their lives were subject to both fascination and scrutiny. Admirers left flowers and letters, but society's gaze was not always kind. For many, the glamour of the theater was shadowed by lingering prejudice. For actors and actresses were sometimes regarded as people living outside the strict codes of respectability. Scandals tied to the theater often grew not from deeds themselves, but from the uneasy mingling of admiration and suspicion. A whispered affair between actor and patron, a friendship too close between playwright and performer, or even an extravagant gift, could become the spark for gossip that rippled through drawing rooms far from the stage itself. The Ledger recalls one such story. A celebrated actress in London was known for her brilliant performances in tragic roles. Her voice carried such depth of emotion that audiences often wept openly. Yet, it was not her roles that stirred whispers, but her patronage. A wealthy benefactor provided her with jewels, gowns, and even a carriage. This generosity, though openly admired, also invited speculation. Was it admiration alone, or something more? The answer, perhaps, mattered less than the murmurs it inspired. The backstage world itself carried its own quiet dramas. Costumes were altered, lines rehearsed in whispers, rivalries subdued behind polite smiles. In these spaces, tension sometimes surfaced in ways audiences never saw. A misplaced word, a subtle glance, or a moment of hesitation could fuel entire conversations whispered in the stalls after the curtain fell. Theatrical scandals were often softened by their distance. What might have been shocking in another setting was excused as part of the stage's mystery. The actress who never married, the actor who traveled frequently with companions, the playwright who lived modestly despite success, these were noticed, but rarely confronted directly. The Ledger makes note of provincial theatres as well. Beyond London, smaller playhouses dotted towns and cities, bringing both entertainment and occasional controversy. There, the boundary between performer and audience was thinner, and stories passed quickly from one to the next. A missed performance, a sudden departure, or a lingering conversation in the wings could easily be reshaped into rumor, yet even in such stories, the Ledger remains gentle. It suggests that these whispers were less about disgrace and more about fascination. In an age bound by rigid rules, the theater represented something freer, something less confined. The stage allowed emotions that society suppressed, passion, sorrow, defiance, to be expressed openly, if only for a few hours. This openness, however, blurred the line between performance and reality. Audiences sometimes carried away impressions that extended into real lives. Was the actress sorrowful off stage, too? Did the actor who played the gallant hero live with the same noble spirit? The inability to separate art from life became its own source of speculation. Some scandals took stranger forms still. There were reports of duels fought over actresses' honor, though the Ledger notes them without detail, as if reluctant to fan the flames further. There were also playwrights accused of borrowing too closely from others' works, yet the tone remained subdued, less an accusation, more a quiet observation. At times, the theater itself became a kind of mirror for society's concerns. Plays that touched on themes of marriage, money, or morality were often received not only as entertainment but as commentary. This, too, could stir conversation, though the ledger notes such discussions as quiet reflections rather than heated debates. Even the very architecture of the theater reflected the tension between visibility and concealment. Bright boxes and balconies showcased the wealthy, while the shadows of the upper gallery held quieter crowds. It was said that one could observe as much intrigue among the audience as on the stage. The ledger closes this entry in its calm, unhurried way. It reminds us that scandal in the theater was often more suggestion than fact, more story than truth. The stage lent itself to mystery, and mystery, softly spoken, was enough to stir imagination. Looking back, these scandals feel less like shadows and more like gentle echoes. They are reminders of how stories can live not only in words or performance, but in the quiet pauses between applause and silence. And now, as we close this gilded curtain, the ledger draws us away from the footlights and the applause. Our next page will turn toward gatherings of another kind, the social circles and salons where reputation was currency, and where scandal sometimes dressed itself in conversation. The Victorian drawing room was both a sanctuary and a stage of its own. Within these elegant spaces, layered with patterned carpets, polished furniture, and portraits on the walls, reputations were quietly tested. Here, scandal did not burst forth with noise but drifted gently, like perfume in the air, carried in low voices, in subtle glances, in the careful art of conversation. For women especially, the drawing room was a theater of influence. Conversations were measured, but much could be conveyed without a word. A hesitation before greeting someone, a pause too long after a name was spoken, these small gestures could be enough to suggest approval, or something less kind. Whispers often surrounded questions of lineage, wealth, and propriety. A marriage arranged too quickly, a guest absent without explanation, or a visitor who lingered longer than expected, these could become the threads from which entire stories were spun. The ledger tells of a hostess renowned for her salons, where intellectuals, artists, and the well-connected gathered. Her evenings were admired, even envied. Yet the admiration was edged with speculation. She had a gift for creating harmony among her guests, but her own life was whispered about in corners. Was her fortune entirely her own? Were her travels solely for leisure? No evidence was ever offered, yet the murmurs continued, soft and persistent. These salons were often filled with music and poetry, readings and recitals that gave voice to thoughts not spoken in ordinary conversation. But even as the verses floated into the air, listeners sometimes heard more than words. Did the poet's lines mirror his own life? Did the singer's tone betray hidden sorrows? Guests listened. But they also watched. The drawing room scandal was rarely dramatic. It was subtle, woven into the fabric of politeness. One guest excused themselves too suddenly, another avoided the eyes of a neighbor. A necklace worn one week and absent the next could spark speculation. Such details, so slight, were nonetheless noted, remembered, and reinterpreted. The ledger speaks too of quiet rivalries. Friendships were treasured, yet fragile. The arrangement of seating at a dinner, or the order of introductions at a gathering, could stir emotions rarely spoken aloud. A slight, however unintentional, could linger long after the evening ended. Within these circles, reputations could be made or unmade without a single confrontation. To be admired was to be spoken of kindly when absent. To be scandalized was to have one's name paired with pauses and glances, with sighs and unfinished sentences. It is telling that the ledger never records these whispers as accusations. Instead, it notes them gently, as if aware that truth mattered less than the fact that the whispers existed at all. For in the drawing room, what was believed often held more weight than what was real. There is a softness to these scandals, for they unfolded not with noise but in silence, not in revelation but in suggestion. They remind us that in Victorian society, scandal was as much about perception as about action. A carefully maintained exterior could conceal uncertainties, and those uncertainties were enough to stir curiosity. The ledger notes that often, these whispers faded with time, replaced by new conversations, new observations, new mysteries. What seemed urgent one evening was forgotten the next, replaced by another gentle ripple on the surface of polite society. It is easy to imagine how restful these gatherings must have been, even amidst their undercurrents. Gentle music, soft laughter, and the warmth of lamplight created an atmosphere both welcoming and calm. The whispers, though perhaps unsettling for those they touched, were carried in voices low and measured, never loud enough to break the rhythm of the evening. The entry closes not with scandal itself, but with reflection. It reminds us that in these rooms, filled with quiet words and careful gestures, lives were shaped in ways both subtle and lasting. And just as easily, they dissolved, forgotten with the passage of time, leaving only the faint trace of a whisper. We leave these rooms softly, as guests might step out into the night after an evening well spent. The next page of the ledger, however, does not take us to salons or theaters, but to a darker corner of Victorian society, the world of crime and deception, where whispers gave way to careful disguises. When we imagine Victorian crime, we may think of lurid tales of shadowy figures and penny dreadfuls, filled with exaggeration meant to shock and entertain. Yet the scandals recorded in this ledger are of another kind. They are quieter, threaded into the fabric of everyday life, and often passed over with only a trace of notice in polite conversation. Among the most common scandals were those of financial deceit. Respectable gentlemen, outwardly steady in their appearance, sometimes wove elaborate schemes of credit and debt. A misplaced investment, a failed business venture, or a misused inheritance could ruin not only the individual but their entire household. These matters, though spoken of only in lowered tones, often left lasting impressions on those connected. The ledger describes one particular case, a merchant who lived comfortably, his family secure in a townhouse lined with elegant furnishings. Yet the wealth was illusory, sustained by borrowed sums and shifting accounts. When the truth emerged, it did not come in an eruption of noise, but in the silent removal of possessions, the closing of shutters, and the disappearance of his name from calling cards and invitations. Forgery too left its quiet mark. With papers easily altered and seals not always secure, some found temptation in the creation of false documents. The consequences were rarely violent, but deeply unsettling for those entangled in the discovery. A letter written in a hand too perfect, or a signature that trembled just slightly, these were enough to unravel trust. And then there were disguises. Not merely the disguises of clothing, but of character. Some lived two lives, one of respectability by day, another in quiet anonymity by night. A gentleman might leave his club in polished attire, only to walk into the fog, don a plainer coat, and vanish into less reputable quarters. The ledger does not accuse, but simply observes the fragile balance between image and reality. Women too appear in these accounts, though often their deceptions were of necessity rather than malice. A widow, pressed by the loss of income, might take in work secretly while maintaining the appearance of comfort. A governess might omit details of her past to secure employment. These were not great crimes, yet in an era where reputation was currency, they became scandals when revealed. The world of fraud extended beyond individuals into institutions. Charities, sometimes founded with noble intentions, could be misused. Collections raised in drawing rooms might never reach the poor for whom they were intended, finding their way instead into private pockets. Such matters rarely reached the courts, but lived on in murmurs, an unspoken awareness that trust could be broken even in the guise of generosity. The ledger describes, 2. The art of disappearance. It was not uncommon for someone facing scandal to vanish quietly, boarding a train or ship under a false name. Some reappeared years later with stories half believed, others faded entirely from memory. In a society that valued continuity and presence, absence itself could be scandalous. These deceptions were often less about greed or cruelty, and more about survival within a rigid social order. To falter financially, to reveal personal struggles, or to admit error was to risk exclusion. And so, deception became not only an act of concealment, but a means of preserving place in the world. The ledger notes one case of a gentleman who, for years, lived under an assumed name in a distant town, having quietly left behind debts and obligations. His scandal was not discovered until after his passing, when papers revealed his former life. His neighbors, who had known him as a model of decency, learned with surprise that his history was more complex than they had ever imagined. These accounts remind us that crime in the Victorian world was not always violent or sensational. More often, it was quiet, concealed beneath appearances of order. And though the consequences were real, the tone of scandal was softened by the very silence with which it was carried. The whispers of these deceptions rarely lasted long. In time, new stories arose, new distractions filled parlors and papers, and what had once seemed weighty dissolved into faint recollection. The ledger records them not to condemn, but to preserve, as reminders of the delicate balance between truth and image in a society so devoted to appearances. As we close this entry, we step gently away from ledgers and shadows, leaving behind the world of deceptions. The next and final page of this collection brings us to reflection, to consider not merely the scandals themselves, but what they reveal of the society that carried them. The Victorian era was an age of contrasts. On one side, rigid formality, industrial progress, and the rhythm of ordered life. On the other, hidden uncertainties, scandals tucked quietly behind curtains, written discreetly into private ledgers. To examine them now is not to pry or condemn, but to understand the fragile balance between appearance and reality. The scandals recorded in this ledger are small, almost domestic in scale. A letter misplaced, a trust broken, a reputation stained ever so slightly. Yet taken together, they remind us that beneath the polished exterior of society, there lived a constant negotiation between truth and concealment, for every grand house in which laughter echoed. There were rooms where whispers carried through thin walls. For every fine gown, there was a hidden tear in the lining, carefully stitched. These imperfections were not anomalies, but part of the fabric of life, evidence that no society, however carefully arranged, could remain untouched by human frailty. Yet there is something gentle in the distance that time provides. What may have been a source of shame then, now appears softened, almost tender, like a faded ink stain on an old letter. Scandals that once weighed heavily on reputations are, in hindsight, small human stories, as fragile as pressed flowers preserved between pages. To reflect on them now is to see not only the mistakes, but the yearning beneath them. The desire to be respected, to be accepted, to hold on to stability. Even the deceptions and silences were, at their core, attempts to preserve dignity in a world that judged so carefully. The ledger does not dwell on punishment, nor on justice, but simply records. In this way, it resembles history itself, patient, impartial, and willing to preserve even the smallest traces of life that others might have preferred forgotten. In listening to these stories, you may find a kind of quiet reassurance. The Victorians, with all their rules and formality, were not so different from us. Their mistakes, their careful concealments, their fragile dignity, all remain familiar, even across the distance of centuries. To imagine their world is to step into a slower rhythm. Gas lamps flickering in the mist. The quiet ticking of a parlor clock. The rustle of skirts across polished floors. Within that rhythm, even scandal becomes subdued, blending into the texture of daily life. It is tempting to wonder how we too might appear, if our daily imperfections and hidden struggles were recorded in a ledger, centuries from now. Perhaps, like these Victorian stories, they would seem less scandalous and more simply human, shadows softened by distance, made almost comforting by the act of remembrance. And so, as the curtains draw to a close on this final entry, what lingers is not scandal at all, but a sense of continuity. The Victorians, for all their secrets, lived as we live, hoping, concealing, persevering. In their quiet missteps, we find not judgment, but kinship. What began as whispers behind parlor doors now rests as echoes in time. Their world has vanished, yet the faint traces remain, like the soft crease in linen long folded away, or the muted scent of lavender in an old chest, and perhaps, as you listen, you feel a lightness in knowing that these stories, once so weighty, now drift like smoke into the past. They ask nothing of us but remembrance, and offer in return a reminder of the gentleness with which time erases even the sharpest of secrets. As this linen ledger closes, let it close softly, like the end of a quiet evening. May the hush of the Victorian parlor, the distant chime of its clock, and the softened voices of its forgotten scandals guide you gently toward rest. Now the pages fall still. The ink no longer runs. The voices of scandal have faded into calm. What remains is silence, steady, reassuring, timeless, and as you settle deeper into quiet, may the weight of these forgotten stories slip away, leaving you only with calm, and the steady rhythm of rest. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,